Well, hi everyone. I'd like to introduce you today to a friend of mine, Christian Toon. Christian is head of professional services or cyber professional services at Pinsent Masons. And we've been introduced from the past connections that we've got, including Andy Rose and other people in our peer group. So today I'm very, very interested to talk to Christian about a number of topics which are really affecting the industry at the moment. But before we jump in, Christian, do you want to just give everyone a brief background as to where you've come from and what your context in cyber is, and then we'll get into the topics.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here. So, hi there, everyone. I am the head of cyber professional services here at Pinsent Masons. Pinsent Masons is a multinational law firm with around 4,000 professionals around the world, headquartered here in the UK, but with offices in Australia, China, Hong Kong, Middle East, and mainland Europe. For myself, I've hit my 7-year anniversary next month, so exciting times. And I've been in the security game now for officially probably about 16, 17 years, as it was kind of defined. I consider myself being in tech and security a hell of a lot longer, but it sort of didn't have that moniker or kind of definition back when I first started. Always been a big lover of technology, and security kind of came with it. I think coupled with my love of comic books and the idea of a superhero keeping others safe, it kind of bleeds a lot into the real world kind of cyber and information security piece of looking after people, looking after organizations, and keeping the bad attackers and hackers, etc., outside of the organizations.
Interesting. So there's a couple of things that immediately sort of spring to mind here. The security superhero. I know we've spoken in the past about security silos, and security is guilty sometimes of owning it too much. This is something I know is very dear to your heart, Christian, but tell me a bit more about your thinking here.
Yeah, so I think for me, there's kind of two parts to it. It's the kind of saving kind of grace of somebody with special skills or attributes that can actually do things to kind of help others and really kind of be driven by good nature and kind of positive impacts on organizations and society at that kind of macro level, in one regard. But then also, I think, take a lot of learnings on how to, say, build a security team from some of the stories of past. And I think the best analogy I've got that I've done talks on before is around how the Marvel Avengers have the absolute kind of ideal blueprint for a security team to bring together people that wouldn't normally work together, that have these special diverse skills and experiences to really step up to the plate when it really matters. And I'm sure you've watched any or one of the Marvel films that have come out, and you'll see that everyone's very different in physicality, in skills, in race, in color, creed, the lot. And actually kind of that's what your security team should look like. And I've had real successes in kind of following that Avenger model.
Interesting. The Avenger model. That's an analogy I haven't heard before. And just out of interest, who's your favorite character?
It kind of depends who I'm watching it with. It will vary from Iron Man through to the Hulk.
Oh, well, I certainly am a bit of a fan of Tony Stark, so let's see if we can follow that.
I think it's the technology. We're drawn to his love of tech for sure.
Interestingly, I love the love of the analog side as well, sitting there with a set of spanners, and there's a real parallel with that in cyber, isn't there? There's the vast depth of the technical, but there's also the real basics that perhaps we need to have as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. Let's keep that in mind. So security as an island and a gatekeeper function. This is kind of a feature, isn't it, Christian, of something that we both see in the kind of professional services world. But is that an advantage or is it a disadvantage? And what implications has that got to the rest of the org?
Yeah, it's an interesting one down there. We tend to sort of see security typically as the sort of isolation station within an organization, the sort of the team and department that traditionally say no to stuff and sit out kind of far left or far right and don't really kind of play well with others. And I think we're guilty sometimes of perpetuating that stereotype by sort of claiming that it's too technical or too detailed for anyone else to understand. And actually kind of in doing so, we kind of perpetuate that isolation. But the reality is it just doesn't help the organization, doesn't help the individuals long term. It's about the need really of building kind of collaborative and collegiate relationships across the organization. And quite often that kind of superhero comic book mentality can have a bit of a downside to it, where kind of people believe that they're the sole superhero of their own story, and actually that they're not. And to actually get through breaches, which is where we see a lot of our clients, and we spend quite a lot of our time in that breach response piece. It's all well and good following the frameworks and standards, but kind of what really matters is that time, how the organization responds and how that team come together to deal with that response. And if those relationships aren't there, if those patterns of communication and positions within the organization, it's quite often that security is shown the door because they can't communicate, or they're just not required at the level that the conversation needs to be had. And it's quite sad because you've got people that are genuinely focused and committed to protecting the organization, but they've not spent time in building those relationships in, I guess, peacetime within the organization to ensure that they have the right levels of recognition, of trust, and capability, and understanding that when cyber goes wrong, it's not just a tech issue, it's not just a CISO issue, it's a business issue.
This is so interesting. I've just gone back to my notes from earlier this week. As you know, I talk to, well, I suppose between 1 and 5 CISOs a day, and you learn so much from this. And I'm going straight back to those notes right now, which is a comment I have not heard in a long time. We were discussing exactly this yesterday, and in another country. But a CISO said to me, the organization has to be rehearsed in, you call it, in peacetime or quiet time. Why? Because I will not be there and available when this kicks off. And I thought, isn't that a very interesting thing, that they were talking about preparedness, rehearsal, muscle memory even came up as a phrase. That's something we start to hear a bit more as well. And saying, I won't be there, you won't be able to communicate with me, I will be heads down coordinating. Interesting. What are your thoughts on that, Christian?
I think that's absolutely the right way to go. I mean, not to say that they're being in a complete vacuum, because there will be elements of communication, but it will be a hell of a lot more limited. You won't have the board or the senior leadership team available or being able to access you or your team at that particular point. There'll be other priorities afoot. So it's important then to understand that. So the senior team member that's always used to picking up the phone and having somebody answer it within 3 rings is probably not going to be there on that 3rd ring during that time of crisis. And there needs to be a clear understanding of expectation, of legal duty and care, as well as oversight and safeguarding for the teams involved.
Okay, legal duty and care. Interesting. This is a very, very, very topical area. Does a breach, now we're going down that path, does a breach get owned by the CISO or the security function, or should it be owned by legal? Or tell me about the, you see so many of these. So where is the optimum game plan and layout of the players here? If we're going to use our cartoon metaphor as well, where do we all sit?
Sure. Well, I think certainly there's no one standard. And I think from what we see in organizations that haven't been breached, it's quite often seen as the sort of CISO or security leader is kind of leading point on that response. That because it's a security breach, the security in their C-level title, they kind of own it. And what they don't anticipate and don't realize is that actually the coordination of that breach or that incident isn't a legal thing, isn't a HR thing, isn't a tech thing, or indeed a security thing. It's a business response. And in my experience, what we see with those breach responses is it becomes very much a senior leadership, by a condensed small senior leadership of CEO, managing kind of director, etc., plus their legal counsel, because effectively they're running the business, they're running it through crisis, they need a bare minimum of legal guidance to ensure they kind of remain compliant. So that kind of big senior leadership team suddenly shrinks massively to a small group of trusted advisors that effectively have the best interests of the company at heart. Quite often, the CISO is far removed from that group because they've not built those relationships previously.
And that's why they fight it alone?
Yeah, I think quite very much so. And they often then will see kind of the conversation just passing them by, or kind of excluded from those particular groups. They've worked on their playbooks. They can bring back technology types working with the tech teams. They've got their kind of compliance stack. They're passing their audits. They're maintaining and managing their systems of security. They're working with leaders on a day-to-day basis. But unless they've elevated themselves to such a position to be in the room with the general counsel or the CEO or senior board teams, but board members, sorry, then they're just seen as a response function, a cog in the wheel of the machine, as opposed to the kind of operators and counsel steering which way it needs to go. The other element I think is quite interesting is, in addition to business response, and I don't know where this is going to go, but something we're sort of observing in our conversations with the security teams is around liability. And typically the role of the CISO or security executive has fallen out of the scopes of directors and officer kind of focus. Yet the cases that are coming out of the US at the moment, there's a lot of professionals I know that are watching that intently, because they're effectively will be held or could be held liable for decisions they're making today to protect that organization. The big case there, I think I'm referring to, is the SolarWinds kind of CISO who's being kind of prodded and focused on by the SEC about the decisions they made and what they presented, and kind of effectively how they manage security for that organization. So in addition to dealing with the response for the business, there's creeping concerns then of, well, actually, how personally liable are they for those breaches, or indeed the decisions that led up to said breach?
That's very interesting, actually, because I was going to ask you a question, which was, how do we get there in the first place? But actually, there's another kind of thread that sprung to my mind, Christian, which is the CISO often is a lobbyist, right? They're trying to educate their organizations, trying to get to the board, trying to engage with the CEO and get airtime. And often, well, there's the word, right? They're trying. They shouldn't have to try. They should be welcomed or even pulled in. So it's almost like Jerry Maguire, isn't it? If you remember the scene, help me, help you. And so if you've got one of those scenarios, and that the board is not engaging, or the senior leadership of an organization is not engaging, how can it be even possible that CISO, who is then responsible, in their own integrity, they then wear it in the absence of the people who are making the decisions for the company, the risk decisions? It's almost extraordinary, isn't it, that we're seeing this?
Yeah, definitely. And I think quite often the security teams, the security community often then believe that, well, we're security, we should be having our time with the board, we should be reporting to the board, we should even be sitting on the board because we're kind of that crucial and that important. And not to downplay their importance, because look, kind of confidentiality, integrity, and availability is just, it's fundamental to many successful organizations. But the reality is, there are many other seats at the table that help run that business and are equally as important. If you can't manage your finances, if you can't manage your customers, if you can't deal with your legal obligations, etc., there's many components of running a successful business. Security, yes, definitely up there in the kind of top 3 business risks. So you kind of then start asking the question, well, if I'm one of many, how do I get myself heard? And the constant sort of attempts of trying to just go in from a security standpoint quite often is met with a, well, sorry, we've got something more pressing this month and we can't see you, or there's other things that we're dealing with. And it's important, I think, firstly, to realize that there may be genuine cases where security isn't important at that particular time. And that's where robust risk management practice and approach comes in, because if you've presented those risks to the best of your ability, and the board or the teams around with the responsibility to make the call on that have evaluated that as per the methodology, per appetite, etc., then actually you've come to a business decision that at the moment, that's not where we need to be. And we're aware that the risks we're running with that, but we need to maintain that status quo. So the security leader there gets the kind of direction that, thank you for bringing this to the attention, but based on this assessment, we're going to kind of let it ride. That then should give them some comfort, albeit it's probably not their desired outcome, that they can then move on to the things that they can control. Quite often, one of the contributing factors to burnout in the security community is that people are striving to do everything as per the security book, that we need that kind of 98% security across everything, and we should all be doing these kind of security controls to a high maturity. And when the businesses don't do that, then that's where we get personally frustrated and challenged with where we are. But the reality is it's a game of give and take, and it will be a roller coaster of maturity through that program. The second point I'd make is coming back to that point of the CISO or security leader going one-on-many. So they're taking that security message to a new audience or to a larger audience. I find that if they start building relationships, rapport, and joining forces with their general counsel or legal teams, they'll have more weight going into that conversation, united together in a common cause. The legal teams want to ensure compliance and making sure that kind of how the organization deals with breaches, legal matters, etc., is in the interest of the organization. And to start having those conversations around legal compliance, litigation risk is hugely powerful and will suddenly amplify the security message. Now, it may be that through that risk management process that they go, yeah, you know what, we need to let that ride for another 30 days or another 3 months because of X, Y, and Z, or they will really start to take stock of the gravity of the situations and maybe kind of go, you know what, yeah, maybe they do need that £500,000 investment, or we do need to do something about this particular issue. Because then it's not just one person shouting from the kind of corner saying we should be doing stuff. You've got 1 or 2, 3 others that are sort of voicing a different lens on the same problem. And I think that's the crucial piece.
Right, so different perspectives from different stakeholders in the business. This brings me to a talk I did a little while ago, but we're publishing this week with someone who essentially runs cybersecurity in a global insurance firm. And it's a very, very complicated thing. And one of the things that they were really talking about was engaging with legal. And that's a journey for them. And it's something that they are trying to educate, but also once they've started that process, they found that legal then started asking the questions because they are then aware to start to think about it from, to your point, what about my perspective around this particular topic? So it was a very interesting use case about how the initial reach out was to legal, but then legal started to get interested because it was what's in it for them and what's in it for their use case and their element of coverage within the business, right? So maybe cyber should be seeding that, Christian, do you think, in different areas to then gather their cohort, if you want to call it that, to address your points?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, typically we've been born out of a technology stack and a technology environment, but actually, as you know, we kind of digital touches every single one of us in every part of our lives today. So it means that our scope needs to be a hell of a lot wider. Right. And if we don't do that as security leaders to sort of push that narrative or to lead with that narrative, I should say, then others will do that on our behalf. And we may then find our voice shrinking within that organization. And the examples I sort of see is we've worked with a number of general counsels now across the globe that are starting to upskill their own legal teams with security and cyber technology expertise. Whether that's those general counsels appointing dedicated cyber or data privacy, data protection lawyers to lead on that. Other organizations have their chief security officer, chief information security officer now reporting into legal. And upskilling of kind of those legal teams is almost bringing a fourth line into play in terms of kind of cyber oversight and ensuring that kind of the teams, whether they be technology or security, are kind of holding their own, or that our training and culture is kind of where it needs to be. So it won't take long for the legal industry of in-house counsel to really get up to speed with that. You've got some very, very smart and motivated individuals that will sort of bring that about. And I think, if anything, for the future of the CISO and kind of those security leadership roles, general counsel will win 99 times out of 100, and they need to start kind of collaborating with their legal counterparts, because the world is going to become, if not already, more of a legal playground, of which we're seeing here in Europe rules around digital and operational resilience, focuses on product security, as well as all the standards and frameworks. Couple that with litigation for when it goes wrong, whether that be business to business or business to consumer, it suddenly very quickly becomes a legal minefield. So work backwards from that position as opposed to working forwards from an ISO standard or a NIST framework.
Interesting. So do you think this is going to be a much stronger trend that we see in the future of security in its wrapper or function reporting to legal then, and that's a new paradigm we need to embrace? Or
reporting lines is a point of contention in the industry, as you know. Quite often we're hung up on just reporting into tech because of the conflict of interest. I think if the organization is aware of its obligations and responsibilities, to a point, I don't think it matters where the security function reports to. And I think if we to start to create a debate now that security now needs to report into legal as opposed to the CTO, I think we'll get lost in that debate. I think the important piece here is about ensuring that kind of legal and security are working together as a combined effort to ensure the organization is suitably resilient and protected where it needs to be. Doesn't necessarily mean that the security function needs to be in one or the legal function needs to be in the other, but we are seeing respective teams kind of draft in new roles to do that for their own understanding and oversight, because security risk has many dimensions, as you know, and is rapidly kind of changing as to how organizations need to defend or what they need to be defending against.
It's an interesting, I don't know, are we at a total turning point in our industry? And I'll give us some context behind that question. I spoke to a real veteran this morning who's been in cyber for 35 plus years this morning, and he was saying to me, this is 101 business basics, and everyone's got lost in the tech, which is interesting. But then there's a whole function in the supply side into our industry, which is all the solution providers. I'm referring more from a SaaS and software perspective. We're at tool saturation, and we are at a point where people are gouging as well. The industry is gouging and really taking advantage of tie-ins and things like that. And so many organizations are saying, got too much data, don't have visibility anymore because we've got too much visibility. So now we're becoming blind from our own inputs. The value in these solutions is actually becoming relatively limited. And the problem is moving to a sort of multifunctional area, as we've said, legal, the business, and so on and so forth. I see this as an incredibly cool and interesting time in our industry, but do you think we're at a tipping point here?
I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think we're very close. I think the vendor marketplace is a very difficult place to navigate if you don't know what you're buying. To your veterans comment before, it's kind of, it's business basics, right? You're kind of making sure you're kind of procuring kind of the right value and service into your organization. It's unfortunately helped by the hype from analyst firms about how big the cyber industry is and how big it's predicted to grow. Of course, then attracts investment and kind of so on and so forth. I do think, however, we've got kind of the same challenges that we had probably 5-6 years ago. Nothing's fundamentally shifted. So what you've got is a kind of Baskin Robbins of the security vendor world, and it's all different flavors of ice cream, but it's still ice cream at the end of the day. And with that, you see more senior kind of experienced security leaders that kind of know what they need, and they have those relationships, and they buy from those relationships, and they build their security portfolio accordingly. They're fine, they're happy, they work through that year in, year out. You then have the sort of disruptors that are actually quite interested in moving from vendor to vendor because it may suit them from a financial point of view, or to kind of the way their business model works. It lends more to that level of flexibility. Then, unfortunately, you have the rest of the world's economies where they perhaps don't have the skills in-house to determine what it is they need or don't need. And everyone's telling them that cyber is one of the sort of top 3 business risks globally, and they should be doing something about it. It doesn't take too long to get a aggressive, or indeed a kind of committed and successful salesperson to kind of do a number, so to speak, on that individual and organization. And before you know it, they're spending millions on products and tech and services that they're not using fully, they're not getting the full value of, or they haven't configured it, they've switched it on and left it to work. And we see quite a lot of organizations having to unpick that now, or when we go in and sort of understand how they've been breached. A lot of the time it's been because tooling's just not working as intended, and quite often comments that we've got vendor A in, so why have we been hacked? It's like, well, doesn't necessarily work like that. So I think there's a real falsehood with a lot of executives that they feel they're buying the services and that should be enough. But conversely, we're seeing, being a law firm at heart, that a lot of clients are now asking what the legal opinion is on appropriate technical and organizational measures. Those ATOM references are littered in a lot of international and indeed local regulations and legislations about how to do security. But you find that the regulators and the standards are often a little bit light in the prescriptive nature of, well, what does that mean? You can follow some of their enforcement notices to sort of determine what they favor and what is expected. Things like multi-factor authentication, it's a bit of a no-brainer. And it's certainly seen in the enforcement notices, say with the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK, that they expect that as a security control. But they don't necessarily give you the statement of applicability or the NIST cyber framework with all the kind of marks on as to the controls you should have, because every organization is going to be different. But one of the rises we've seen as a result of that is we're currently dealing with 3 matters at the moment where clients have asked us for that legal opinion on what is appropriate, what is deemed in the eyes of the law to be an appropriate technical and organizational measure. And I'm pleased to say that 2 of those matters we're looking at have actually been instigated by the CISO, which is great to see, because they're starting to think more like a business leader.
Oh, you've unpacked so many interesting things, but let's dive. It will hybridize into another question in a moment, but the appropriateness of a control, and you also mentioned controls failure. This is one of the things I think we are going to see vast focus on, because in the past everyone bought stuff, whatever that stuff was, to do a job, right, and a function. Doesn't matter what it was, and you know, and the theme of security control that it had, but you know, they bought stuff to do it. People are starting to question the financial side of it, but I'm now personally questioning the efficacy. So let's say we put an appropriate control in, and I'm actually so motivated by this area, Christian, that I'm actually going to start a newsletter on this area alone, which is the Security Operations Center. So let's say we put a SOC in place, that's appropriate. However, there's a whole bunch after that of the investment that people are missing in that tuning and making an appropriate control truly appropriate to a business, right? So do you see failures around these controls in the breach work that you do? And what are the lessons learned that you would pull out from that? Because it's such an important area.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. I think the failures don't necessarily come from the control operations. They come from the control designs from where we see. So the security providers, say the Security Operations Center, as you mentioned there in the example, they do good operations management, log correlation, etc. But if you've not kind of given them the use cases or kind of gone through your threat assessments to determine, I'm worried about logins from Iran and not Ipswich, or kind of I only operate on land, like inland within Australia, and kind of I'm not worried about connections elsewhere, or all the varying use cases that you will have as a business, then yeah, that is in my eyes not appropriate. But it's not for me or you or other security professionals necessarily to deem that. That's where that legal opinion comes in, because we're talking about regulatory engagements here and their understanding and their position on what is appropriate. So we can make recommendations, of course we can, as seasoned security professionals, but that's where you need that legal defensibility to come through and kind of make that call, because it's the control designs, and yes, by virtue their operations, and in turn failures to protect the organization because they're not doing what they should be doing. But that comes very much early on in their design, because if we really thought about how these controls are going to operate, or indeed how we may need to operate them, or indeed how the supplier needs to operate them, and then the impacts of those operations onto business, maybe escalating of findings or discoveries, etc. All of that sort of needs to be taken into account. And it's quite often just overlooked, or indeed not considered, because the teams or organizations that are bringing these on board aren't equipped to deal with it, or don't have the training or understanding as to the true impact, because maybe they're just traditional technology teams that typically on their day-to-day business, they maintain a kind of a light cloud environment and sort of traditional business kind of office type applications, and security isn't in their domain. So it's these sorts of things that kind of cause I guess the combination of these challenges really do kind of cause that bigger event, that bigger issue. But the security vendor piece is quite interesting, that going back to the earlier point about kind of there's a lot out there now and it's becoming quite convoluted in terms of a market. Certainly starting to see a lot more commoditisation in those services, because certainly financially driven, where the decisions are made that you may be not getting that kind of security increase in your budget this year, that the security leaders are smart enough to start pushing down and into their supply chain to say, well, look, I need a better return on the investment here, or I need more creative ways of which we can buy these services. And I think for me, the standout example is penetration testing. At its heart is quite simply an audit working through a series of checks and balances against kind of known frameworks. There's already organizations that are automating it. So perhaps long are the days gone where you need an actual person to kind of push the keys on a keyboard for that. And you can automate that and kind of move that into sort of commodity type pricing. Obviously, more advanced testing requires an element of human involvement, but kind of pen testing at its heart, I think, is certainly one of those. You then look at incident response, perhaps, as another area, or managed services around security operations. managed detection and response type capabilities. They're all using a similar type of platform to do so. They're all kind of offering the same sort of service for 24/7 follow the sun type service models, etc. So again, not saying it's entirely foolproof, but sort of there are other areas that are coming through that we're seeing could be commoditized, and it becomes a race to the bottom. And actually, I think that kind of pricing shock is kind of well overdue. I think I'm quite sick of seeing kind of sports cars and kind of excessive marketing campaigns by a lot of these vendors that actually, you know what, I don't really worry too much about seeing a logo on the side of a race car, but you know what, I'd like a good price for a good product.
This is you're speaking to my total geeky heart here. This is so very important. The ROI, the maturity around this, the control design, the balance of time, money, skill in making all this happen. It's horrifying me, Christian, about the lack of maturity and investment in these tool sets that actually are designed to help people. And you mentioned about the design and threat model. I'm definitely going to be taking a takeaway from this today, which is I would love to see group legal involved in some of these designs. I have never in my career heard that. I think it needs exploring because we've got to satisfy conditions. People take it as binary, isn't it? Which is we're protecting the organization or we're not. So here's a tool to protect the organization. But the biggest concern I have right now, and we've done so much work around this, is the efficacy of those tools and the failure to deliver a decent ROI on that. And then Q, your area of the world and your core expertise, which is looking at the breaches and the results of why do these tools not do their job. And it's such a fundamental part of the root cause now, isn't it? So in the last couple of minutes we've got together, can you just share with me your thoughts about those root causes and how tools are either helping or not, and where we need to take things going forward on the basis of this conversation?
Sure. So I think in 99% of the breaches I've worked on, it comes down to that kind of initial human point in the kill chain, where an individual or their account has been targeted, quite often through traditional phishing and email compromise, because we click links, as we all do as a society. We can't get away from that. I think kind of a linkless organization is about as far-fetched as the paperless office was portrayed as. And it's just one of those challenges we all have to deal with. I mean, I clicked a link to join you today, and thankfully it wasn't a phish, and you're not trying to convince me that I need to send you hundreds of thousands of pounds or just my password. So that is still the focal point for a majority of these breaches. And if it's getting through, if they were that easy to spot, the tech teams would have already kind of pulled them from the inboxes, but they're not. They're becoming very difficult. They're coming from trusted accounts that have been compromised elsewhere, and it just makes it a lot harder. And we need to do more to bring the end user, our people, into that conversation. We need to give them the support and understanding of how to and what to look for. But equally, quite often, and certainly seeing now, is that, yes, we're not necessarily being phished as much as we used to be. We're being spearphished. Spearphished for me, or spearphishing, is the new norm. So that targeted email kind of compromise of previously that came with the moniker, what we're seeing now is actually that's the norm. And actually businesses are just being targeted at scale by some very, very good attempts to compromise. And that leads into then the access. And once the access has been compromised, we then sort of see that knock-on effect of poor network segmentation, poor detection controls, poor conditional access, as I sort of alluded to before, that actually you've never had anyone in Peru log into your data center before. So why are they doing it at 5 p.m. on a Friday? And thinking about the organization as a hard shell, historically, you just try and keep people out. It's kind of, they're getting in, and they are in if they're not already. So it's then looking at those internal controls that limit the damage and limit the the access or indeed the activities that those unauthorized users have. And quite ultimately, the backup and recovery capability is just lacking. And if we assume a breach state, then actually we want to work backwards. And it's not necessarily stopping them getting in. It's, well, they get in, how are we going to get back up and running? And organizations just typically will try and run their environment to a cloud base or tape backup service, thinking, well, it's backed up, it's fine, but actually don't necessarily understand the intricacies around the services that support their applications, the applications themselves, or indeed the priorities. And that's another one that quite often catches people out, is that everyone wants a 24-hour SLA to recover their email or kind of their applications and get them back up and running. And quite often that is nigh on impossible. You're talking weeks, not hours, to get these systems back up and running. So what are you going to do? Assuming you can get them back up and running, but that's a sort of a big casing point. And a lot of the time, organizations spend focus post-breach on basically getting them back up to standard.
It's such an intellectual and professional minefield, challenge, wonder to work in. And I find it keeps me alive, this stuff. It's so very interesting. I know it certainly does for you as well, Christian, but I think we need to wrap up there. But may I say thank you very much. What an absolutely interesting, multi-threaded conversation. Can't wait to see the write-up on this as well, and to share that with our community. But for the moment, Christian Toon, Head of Cyber Professional Services at Pinsent Masons. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dan.